Welcome to Thriller Vault. Tonight I have a creepy true story about the perfect husband. A quick disclaimer. While this story is mostly true, I've adapted it into a story form, so some conversations, thoughts, events, and details may be fictional and or speculation. This is The Perfect Husband. I met my first wife, Lynn, at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. On our first date, I knew I would marry her. Lynn was perfect for me. Throughout college, we were always together. Harold and Lynn, together forever. We had so much in common. We were both devout Christians. We both loved the outdoors and traveling. She was smart like me. She was a beautiful redhead, a perfect complement to my own good looks. Also like me, she was tall, so I knew our kids would be tall, smart, and handsome Christians. Most importantly, she let me lead in our relationship, as a Christian man should. We were married in 1982, and we moved to Colorado, the perfect place to enjoy the outdoors. We enjoyed many years of wedded bliss, just the two of us. I worked as a Christian fundraiser, but I didn't bring in enough money to support a family, and neither did Lynn's job as a social worker. Money was always a struggle for us. There was never enough. By the early 90s, we were finally ready to start a family. We tried, but Lynn couldn't conceive. The doctors discovered that she had several benign tumors, which were preventing conception. I knew the problems weren't on my end. The doctors assured us that after her tumors were removed, Lynn should be able to have children. I wasn't so sure. Lynn was getting older. She was in her mid-30s. Over 35 is considered a geriatric pregnancy, after all. I was worried about the surgery, which was scheduled for the summer of 1995, so I purchased a life insurance policy for Lynn, worth $300,000. You never know, right? May 6th, 1995 is a night I will never forget. Lynn and I went out to eat at Sedalia Grill, and we had a great meal. On the way home, I noticed the tire felt low, so I pulled over on a lonely Colorado roadside. I checked the tires. I was right, as usual. The front right tire on our trusty Jeep Cherokee was low. Unfortunately, I didn't have a pump, so I'd have to change the tire. Thankfully, I had a full-size spare in the rear hatch for just such an occasion. I grabbed the jack from the rear hatch. The jack that came with the Jeep was sticking, so I had to use a boat jack and a cinder block. The boat jack wasn't tall enough to prop the Jeep, so I had to use the cinder block to make it higher. I lined up the cinder block and jack under the Jeep while Lynn held the flashlight. It was so dark, and Lynn did a poor job of illuminating what I needed. Women aren't the best at auto repairs. Because I couldn't see, I placed the jack against the axle instead of the frame. It didn't help that I was tired. I had been up since 6, trying to raise money for Christian churches. Despite Lynn's ineptitude, I removed the lug nuts and the tire. Then I dropped the lug nuts and they rolled under the car. Can you believe that? Everything was going wrong. I took the old tire to the rear hatch and threw it inside. When I tossed the heavy tired rim into the back, the cinder block crumbled and the Jeep fell off the boat jack. When the Jeep fell, it didn't sound right. It wasn't like metal hitting the asphalt. It was more of a crunch. So I peeked around the corner of the Jeep and I saw Lynn struggling, face down, pinned by the brake rotor on her upper back. Apparently, she had gone under the Jeep to get the lug nuts. Why did she do that? I would have gotten them. I rushed to her and tried to lift the Jeep, but it was too heavy. Lynn was in really bad shape. Her eyes bulged, her face was swelling. She was still alive, but she couldn't breathe. So I used the second boat jack I had in the rear hatch to lift the Jeep off of her. Everything after that was a blur. Some people stopped to help. EMTs came to the scene. They worked on Lynn, giving her CPR and medication strong enough to give a pulse to a stone. A helicopter landed on that desolate roadside and took Lynn to a trauma hospital, the Swedish Medical Center near Denver. Doctors did what they could, but she died in surgery. I know this story is crazy, and you might be thinking I had something to do with my wife's tragic death, but the autopsy corroborated my story of Lynn being crushed by the Jeep. She had no defensive wounds, suggesting that she was not forced under the vehicle. I was devastated. I was still a young man, and my wife was gone. We were planning to conceive a child that summer, and now that dream was gone too. I struggled for quite some time. until I met Tony in 1999. We met on the Christian Mingle dating site. I think my dating profile described me quite well. 40s, 6 feet tall with a toned physique, wavy brown hair, and brown eyes. I'm an outgoing, fun, caring, sincere, growing man of God, one who is very young at heart, is passionate about life, has a great sense of humor, and who communicates well. Friends would also probably add that I'm an active, adventurous, trustworthy, sensitive man who has a heart for others, especially children, and is a good listener. Even though I've never had any children, I'm a dedicated uncle to 15 nieces and nephews. I'm also usually described as being tall, dark, athletic, and attractive. In many ways, Tony reminded me of Lynn. She was also a devout Christian. She was beautiful and craving the leadership of a strong Christian man, as well as a child, but she was already 37, so her clock was ticking. She was also quite intelligent, as she was an ophthalmologist with a thriving practice in Mississippi. She came from a wealthy family who made their money in the oil business. On New Year's Eve of 1999, I met Tony's family, the Bertolets. I flew to Mississippi and we all met in Tony's condo. Tony and I made 3 major announcements that night. The first was that we had been dating for several weeks on the internet, which was quite strange back then. We were trailblazers, so to speak. The second was that we were going to marry. And the third was that Tony would move to Colorado with me. I was worried that Tony's parents might not like me. They might feel like I was taking their only daughter away from them. But I won them over. I was polite. Please and thank yous, yes sir and yes ma'am, opening doors and pulling out chairs and all that. I told Tony's father that I would take care of Tony and I would buy her a $1 million house in Colorado. Tony's brothers, Todd and Barry, they seemed more skeptical. I told them about the year I spent as a geologist with Chevron. They seemed to like that, given the family oil business. Tony and I set a wedding date for September of 2000, less than a year after we met. I know it was fast, but we just knew. And Tony had a ticking clock. I had a few disagreements with the Bertolets while planning the wedding. I mean, I was doing all the wedding planning, yet they wanted control. That's not how it works. For example, they wanted to put Tony's name first on the wedding announcements. It would have read Dr. Tony Bertolet and Mr. Harold Henthorn. It was so disrespectful to me. First of all, my name should be first. And Dr. Tony Bertolet? She doesn't need to flaunt her education like that. Like I said, it's disrespectful. Tony's mom tried to show me some Emily Post nonsense that said that was how it was, but not at my wedding. Then there was the rehearsal dinner. I asked Tony's brother Todd to reserve the venue for me. I'm still living in Colorado. They're the ones that wanted the venue in Mississippi. Then I hear he's complaining that I never paid him back. All he had to do was ask me for the money, and I would have given it to him. But it seems to me that he'd rather complain behind my back. I heard Tony's brothers were bothered that they weren't groomsmen, but they never really liked me, so I made them ushers. I didn't want them standing with me on the most important day of my life. Despite the headaches I endured with Tony's family, we had a beautiful southern wedding at the First Baptist Church in Jackson, Mississippi. The reception was held at an antebellum mansion. We honeymooned in Hawaii. It was a storybook beginning. But the first few years of our marriage were difficult. It took Tony 2 years to sell her ophthalmology practice. So for 2 years, I commuted between Colorado and Mississippi. It was hard on me. In 2002, after selling her practice, she finally moved in with me in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. Colorado suited Tony. She became involved in the church and the community. She got a job at Associates in Eye Care in Cherry Creek. But the best was yet to come. In 2005, Tony gave birth to our daughter, Haley. Tony was 43 at the time, and it was a difficult birth. I was afraid I might lose her. The labor was progressing too slowly, and Tony's blood pressure was too high, so the doctor had to perform a C-section. Thankfully, Tony and Haley were healthy. I don't know what I would have done if I would have lost them. I was a very involved father right from the start. Tony went back to work, but I stayed home with Haley. Tony did well as an ophthalmologist, and she owned a 4% interest in the family oil business that paid anywhere between $2,000 and $24,000 a month, depending on the price of oil. I was busy with Haley, so my work suffered, and Tony enjoyed the finer things, so money was a little tight, but we were fine. I told Tony if she wanted to live like the spoiled Southern belle she was, then she'd need to make more money. Then I found out that she told her brother that I'm not pulling my weight. It's such a double standard. If I was a woman, nobody would say a word. I didn't come from money like Tony. I could have been making more than her, easily, but I was taking care of Haley. That was more important. I was taking care of the financial planning. Tony didn't know anything about investing. Investing is something I've always been very good at. Tony was lucky to have me. Otherwise, her money would have been in some savings account earning 1% interest, not even keeping pace with inflation. After Haley was born, we were so busy. We didn't have time to take vacations with Tony's parents. We had our own family vacations, but the Bertolets blamed me for Tony drifting away from her parents and brothers. It was like they wanted to keep Tony for themselves, but we were our own family. And I don't think Tony's family was always a good influence on Haley. They always had their televisions blaring, and I didn't want Haley exposed to all the nonsense on the idiot box. But when I politely asked them to turn off the TV, they acted like I was the one being rude. I was always the one to blame. I remember calling Tony's dad and wishing him a happy birthday. We talked for like 10 minutes, and then he wanted to talk to Tony, so I gave her the phone. But she only talked to him for a few minutes. I heard the Bertolets blame me for that. It wasn't my fault. Tony's a grown woman. It is true that I always answered the phone, but that was because Tony was stressed, and I was doing all I could to help. After all, women aren't the best at dealing with stress. We had problems with the in-laws and some minor money problems, but by and large, our marriage and our family life were wonderful. We were all so blessed. I never thought things would turn out the way they did, though. I loved Tony with all my heart, but she was a serious klutz. I mean, it was so bad that it was dangerous. We own this cabin in Grand Lake, which is a fishing and boating resort on the border of the Rocky Mountain National Park. In 2011, we were there having a great mini vacation on the Memorial Day weekend. Haley was almost 9 years old at the time. We were having some construction done on the cabin deck, and there were some large beams lying about, leaning against the house. It was quite precarious, so we were careful to avoid them. But at like 10 o'clock at night, I was on the deck and I called for Tony. She came barreling out of the house like a klutz. She must have hit one of the beams because it fell and hit her on the back of the neck. I thought she was dead. The paramedics took her to the emergency room. The doctor thought she might have broken her back. The little hospital in Granby wasn't equipped to deal with a broken back, so they sent her to the Swedish Medical Center in Denver. I was hit with this terrible feeling of deja vu, as that was where my first wife, Lynn, had died. I prayed and prayed and prayed, and God answered my prayer. Tony was okay. Her back wasn't broken. Thank God. She had to undergo physical therapy, and she had lingering pain, but she was okay. God had protected her. Then, a little over a year later, I took Tony on a romantic getaway for our 12th anniversary. I had been planning it for months. A few months earlier, I had gone to the Rocky Mountain National Park for a scouting trip to find the best place to take Tony. I had originally planned to go to Bear Lake, which is a flat, easy hike with a beautiful lake that reflects the surrounding mountains. But I decided against Bear Lake because I thought too many people would be around. I wanted a private, romantic setting. So I chose the Deer Mountain Trail for our anniversary hike. This hike wasn't as popular as Bear Lake, so it would be much more private. It was a much longer hike on difficult terrain, too. Now, Tony had bad knees from her time as a basketball star, but she never complained, so I thought she'd be fine. I wanted our anniversary weekend celebration to be a surprise, so I covertly coordinated with Tony's office staff to clear her appointments on that Friday, September 28th. They even put fake appointments to preserve the surprise until the last moment. It was so romantic. I even hid in an exam room, posing as Tony's fake appointment. Then when she came in, I said, "Surprise!" So we packed up the Jeep. Don't worry, this wasn't the same Jeep that killed my first wife. Then we drove 90 minutes to Estes Park in the Rocky Mountains. On that Friday evening, we checked into the Stanley Hotel. That's the hotel that inspired the setting for The Shining by Stephen King. Pretty cool, huh? On Saturday, we drove to the trailhead between 1:30 and 1:45 p.m. for that awesome hike I had planned for us. It was a beautiful day. There's nothing like hiking in the Colorado Rockies. We hiked the first 3 miles through the meadow into the pine forest and up the mountain. Instead of taking the last leg up to the Deer Mountain summit, we went off trail searching for a romantic lookout spot. At about 3:30, we found a nice rocky outcropping atop a ridge. It was a beautiful view. We had lunch for about an hour. We had planned to leave at 4:45 to make it back to Estes Park for an 8 p.m. dinner reservation at a fancy steakhouse, but Tony spotted turkey and deer with her binoculars, so we stayed on the mountain a little longer. She was having such a great time. We took turns taking pictures from our romantic lookout. Tony told me where to stand for a photo. I posed according to my wife's instructions, but then I received a text from the babysitter, so I checked it. The babysitter was letting us know that Haley had won her soccer match. As I checked the text, I saw a blur out of the corner of my eye. When I looked up from my phone, Tony was gone. I looked over the edge. She was lying on the rocks below. I was in a panic. I called down to her, but she didn't say anything. It took me like 45 minutes to climb down the mountain to get to her. Why did she have to be so clumsy? When I reached her, I checked her pulse. She was alive, but unconscious. I dragged Tony to a flatter area where she would be more comfortable so I could do CPR. When I dragged her, Tony's head and shoulders bounced against the rocks, leaving a bloody trail. I called 911. I tried to give her CPR. I did everything I could, but she died on that mountainside. And I was a widower. Again. The park rangers wanted to interrogate me, but I had to be with Haley. I had to break the news to her. I was devastated for myself and for my daughter. It was the first time I questioned my faith in God. I thought, how much tragedy does one man have to endure? The next day, October 1st, 2012, U.S. Park Service Ranger Mark Flaherty came to my house to interview me. I led Ranger Mark into the living room where I turned on my laptop. He tried to ask me questions, but I wouldn't answer any questions until he watched the slideshow. I had prepared it the night before. It was a montage of family pictures of me and Tony and Haley. I wanted Ranger Mark to understand who we were before he started his investigation. Even though Ranger Mark could see how much I loved Tony from the slideshow, he asked the most insensitive questions. He was concerned about such nitpicky details. He said that our babysitter's text didn't match my timeline of events. He said that the babysitter's text was sent an hour after Tony's fall. I didn't have an answer for that. I was under a lot of stress. It's normal to make mistakes on little details. My wife, the love of my life, had died for heaven's sake. Maybe I wasn't reading the babysitter's text. Maybe I was checking for the text because I knew Haley's game was ending around that time. Ranger Mark asked if I had a life insurance policy on Tony. I thought, what a crass question to ask at a time like this. Of course, I told him about the $1.5 million life insurance policy I had on Tony. I know what you're thinking, but Haley is the sole beneficiary of the policy. I'm just a trustee. That wasn't the worst thing that Ranger Mark did that day. He waited until the end of the interview, and he pulled out this map that was in a plastic evidence bag. It was a map of the Rocky Mountain National Park. The Rangers had retrieved it from my Jeep, without my permission, mind you. On the map, I had traced our hiking route with a pink highlighter. There was a pink X marking the spot exactly where Tony had fallen. I was speechless. I didn't remember making that X, so I answered honestly, telling him that I didn't know why that X was on the map. The medical examiner corroborated my story, saying that Tony's injuries were consistent with someone who fell from a great height. They made a big deal about Tony's intact sternum. Apparently it's common for CPR recipients to have their sternum broken during chest compressions. The implication was that I never gave Tony CPR, but that's BS. I'm not a medical professional. I probably didn't do the chest compressions hard enough. I didn't want to hurt her. The Bertolets were difficult after Tony died. They wanted to bury her in Mississippi, but her home is in Colorado with me and Haley. I did what Tony wanted, which was the same thing that Lynn had wanted when she died. I had her cremated. The Bertolays flew to Denver for the memorial service. Even though I was still traumatized, I told them what had happened in excruciating detail. When I mentioned that I was frustrated and annoyed with the U.S. Park Service because I felt that they were accusing me of killing Tony, the Bertolays had nothing to say. If they cared about me, they would have vouched for me. I told Tony's parents, I just want to get on with my life, and they're bothering me right now. But again, the Bertolays said nothing. I think the Bertolays thought I killed Tony too. After everything I did for Tony, it was a slap in the face. I showed the Bertolays the slideshow I had prepared for the memorial service, but they weren't impressed. I had spent hours on it. I heard that Todd said, basically the video was the Harold Henthorn show. There are photos there that are just of Harold. There are pictures that Tony isn't even in at her own funeral. Harold cranked up the volume so loud that the family had to tell him to turn it down. Can you believe how rude and insensitive they were being? Despite the fact that I already had a funeral for Tony, the Bertolays just had to have another funeral in Mississippi. I never should have gone, but they already thought I was responsible for Tony's death. I thought if I didn't show up, that would just be more fuel for their fire. It was a no-win situation for me. How would you feel if your in-laws thought you killed your wife? I sat there with my legs crossed and my foot bouncing. I was agitated and angry. They kept asking me questions about the investigation. I was already stressed about it, so I went off. I was calling Ranger Mark Barney Fife and telling them how ridiculous it is that they're obsessed with my map. Then they kept asking me for more details about what happened with Tony. Finally, I told them that Tony was clumsy. That shut them up. But Ranger Mark wasn't like Barney Fife. He was more like a pit bull with a bone. He refused to let it go. Apparently, he went back to the ledge where Tony had fallen. It took Ranger Mark 15 minutes to crawl down the mountain, which I thought, so what? But they made a big thing of me telling them that it took me 45 minutes to climb down the mountain. Ranger Mark thought it was suspicious that there was an hour gap between the time Tony fell to the time I called 911. He thought I should have called 911 right away, but I was trying to get to my wife, and I was trying to help her. I knew it would take too long for the paramedics. I was her only hope. Ranger Mark was obsessed with Tony's life insurance policy too. I had told him the truth about the $1.5 million policy. I had changed the beneficiary of the trust from Haley to me, but I didn't look at it like that. That money would be used to care for Haley to put her through college. I forgot to mention the two other $1.5 million policies I had on Tony, but after my history with Lynn, you can't blame me for being cautious. Life insurance is really important. After Lynn died, Lynn's brother, Kevin, and his wife, Grace, they split up. With Grace left to care for the children, I talked her into letting me set up a policy for her. I was the beneficiary of that $400,000 policy too, but it wasn't for me. I would give that money to Grace's children, but they would need someone like me, someone they can trust, to manage the money for them. The investigators kept digging into my background. They thought they had something big when they didn't find any businesses in my name or any clients, despite the fact that I told them I did nonprofit fundraising for churches and hospitals and I was financially secure. I did do nonprofit fundraising, but not for myself. I gave all the money away. You don't need a business to give everything away. I tried to act as Jesus would act, and they were persecuting me, just as Jesus was persecuted. Then, to make things worse, the Douglas County Sheriff's Department reopened Lynn's case. They made a big deal about Lynn's $300,000 insurance policy. Everyone's so concerned about money. It's not Christian. I had told them about the $300,000 insurance I had on Lynn, but I had forgotten to tell them about the second $300,000 policy. I was distraught. I had just lost my first wife. I wasn't thinking about the money. The Sheriff's Department also dug up the first responders at Lynn's accident. One of them said that I said that Lynn was changing the tire because I didn't know how to change a tire. But I never said that. I'm a strong Christian man. Of course I know how to change a tire. She crawled under there on her own. The Douglas County Sheriff's Department even recreated Lynn's death using a similar Jeep and jacks as I had described. These people are sick. A female deputy, the same size as Lynn, got under the rotor, confirming that it was in fact possible. They also went to the location and dropped the lug nuts in various ways, but they never rolled under the car far enough that someone would have to crawl under the Jeep to get them. But that test was flawed. The lug nuts might have rolled off my shoe or my leg. Despite that, the sheriff's department concluded that someone would have had to throw them under the Jeep. In addition, they tried to recreate throwing the spare into the back, but they couldn't get the jack to topple. The only way to get the Jeep to topple was to kick it on the fender, right where the boot print was in 1995. This one looks bad, I know, but I put my boot on that fender before I even took off the tire. I was just stretching my leg. I think the Douglas County Sheriff's Department knew I was innocent because they decided not to bring charges against me in Lynn's case. Tony's case was a different story. They took 2 years digging up everything they could. For the first year, the Bertolets pretended to be on my side so they could see Haley, but I knew they were watching me and reporting everything back to the police. What a bunch of snakes. When the Bertolets finally went public with their belief that I was guilty, I knew I couldn't let them see Haley because they would poison her against me. I'm all she has left in the world. If she thought I killed her mother, what would that do to her? But the Bertolets didn't care about that one bit. They even tried to fight me for custody in family court with their fancy lawyer, but God was on my side, and Haley remained where she belonged, with me. But it was only a temporary victory. I was finally arrested in November of 2014, after over 2 years of investigation. I was charged with 1 count of murder in the first degree with a maximum penalty of life in prison. Haley went to the Bertolets, just as they wanted. Upon arraignment, the judge denied me bail, so I was stuck in jail for a crime I didn't commit. The trial was a circus of lies. Everyone was against me. But I was the victim. I was the widower, not a murderer. During the trial, the state made a huge deal about Tony opening an individual bank account and transferring money into the account shortly before she died. They insinuated that Tony was planning to leave me. This wasn't news to me. I knew about the account and the money. I thought we should keep our money together, but with more accounts, you do have more FDIC coverage. There wasn't any physical evidence, though. There was no sign of a struggle between me and Tony, but the jury still found me guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced me to life in prison without parole. I'm currently stuck in federal prison. It's a grave miscarriage of justice. I know the truth. God knows the truth. God willing, my appeal will come through and I'll be released. God willing, I'll marry again. Thank you for listening and watching Thriller Vault. If you like these stories and you'd like to hear more thrillers from me, you can find my audiobooks at your favorite retailer. Just search Phil M. Williams. Please like, share, and subscribe. I hope you all come back next week for another thriller story.